You know the Yule Goat, right? That charming, festive figure. Think again. What if I told you its origins are steeped in ancient animal sacrifice? A chilling remnant of pre-Christian winter rituals meant to appease unseen forces during the darkest days of the year. Prepare to see this innocent symbol in a terrifying new light. Forget everything you thought you knew about the Yule Goat. This isn't just a quaint holiday tradition. It's a direct descendant of primal fears and desperate measures. We're about to uncover the disturbing truth behind its cheerful facade, tracing its lineage back to the gruesome practices of Northern European winter rites. Snow falls thin as salt dust. The light inside the house doesn't blaze. It's only enough to leave a pale wash of gold on the window pane. On the sill, a straw goat lies still, bound with a small piece of string. It looks gentle. It belongs to the holiday season, hurriedly wrapped gifts, laughter held close for warmth in the short days. But some symbols weren't born to decorate. They were born to stand guard. Some things look familiar because they have learned to hide the reason they exist. The question isn't what the goat represents. The question is, what did it replace? In northern homes, winter is not only weather, it is a force. It moves through wooden walls, through door cracks, through the creak of the roof when the wind shifts. It stretches darkness beyond patience. It makes people hear the sounds daylight usually covers, the soft snap of fire, the water inside the pipes, the weight of their own footsteps. And when everything becomes too quiet, the mind starts filling the empty space with old things. Not because it wants to believe, but because it needs a way to endure. The straw goat is still there, close to the threshold. That place is not an accident. A door is where the outside world touches the inside one. A door is where the cold tests whether a home can still hold its warmth. And in the memory of communities that live near the snow line, the threshold is not only architecture, it is a boundary that must be respected, a boundary that sometimes has to be marked, as if telling the long night, someone lives here, there is fire here, the pulse of life is still here. Straw that light. Dry material is not accidental either. It is what remains after the harvest, a reminder that there were sunny days, that grain once filled the hands, that voices once carried across the fields. When winter comes, straw becomes warmth, bedding, shelter from the wind. It is the leftover of life brought indoors, a way of storing the warm season in its simplest shape. And when straw is braided into the form of a goat, a small object begins to carry a quiet task, holding a memory, even if that memory has been softened over many generations. In the present, the goat is only a decoration, a folk touch, something cute, but things that last rarely survive on appearance. They survive on a function people no longer name. Some traditions repeat like habit because the body remembers before the mind understands. Some signs are hung up because some part of the human still wants to believe the dark season can be crossed more safely if the threshold is kept the right way. The straw goat lies still, like a small sentence that makes no sound. It doesn't tell a story. It doesn't explain. It only leaves a feeling that there were winters when staying alive was something done through order, through a low fire, through things placed where they belonged. And if this symbol once stood here to guard a boundary, then the next question is, where did that boundary once lead? Morning comes slowly. The light doesn't truly drive the night away. It only makes the snow change color from black to gray. Inside the wooden house, everything keeps the small rhythm of the cold season. The fire burns low, warmth gathers close to the floor, and the wind sometimes touches the doorframe, like a hand testing the lock. The straw goat is still lying there, not placed at the center of the table, not hung in the prettiest spot. It sits near the window, near the threshold, near the place where the outside world could step in through a single gap. If this were only decoration, that position would not matter. But in traditions that last, position is always part of the meaning. Things placed at a doorway are rarely there just to look pleasant. They are signs. They speak in silence, saying, this boundary is being held. And in winter, a boundary is not an abstract idea. It is the difference between warmth and cold, between food that remains and an empty storehouse, between the people inside and what cannot be invited in. There is an old kind of knowing that doesn't live in books. It lives in how people step through a door, in how they slide a latch, in how they set a small object in the right place, as if finishing a sentence. In long snow regions, The threshold was once the weak point, and also the place that needed the most care. To set a sign, there was a way of saying, "This house will not drift in the dark season. It has order, it has limits, it knows what belongs inside, and what must stay out." The straw goat, then, is not only the shape of an animal, it is the shape of a decision that winter will not be allowed to move deeper, that the cold will stop where it should stop, that fear, even if it cannot be erased, can still be placed on the other side of the door. And what is striking is this: no one needs to stand up and explain any of it. No loud words are required. Only the straw figure lying in the right place. Only repetition across many years, like a rhythm the hands remember on their own. When a symbol shifts from heavy to light, it does not disappear. It only changes its voice. What is weighty is tucked down deep. What is pleasant is brought to the surface. The straw goat becomes part of the holiday season of photographs, of warm market stalls. Yet the fact that it still so often sits near the door is a loose thread showing along the seam. A small thread, reminding that this once belonged to the language of boundaries, not only to decoration. Dry straw carries the scent of old fields. It holds the shape of the warm season in a simple body, and when it is braided into a goat, it takes on one more layer, a memory of what once kept people alive, and what may once have been weighed against the demands of winter. There is no need to name that yet. It is enough to watch how the goat lies like a sign, and to listen to how the wind still searches for a way through the cracks. Because when a door is where worlds touch, old stories rarely begin in the middle of a room. They begin at the threshold, and if the straw goat has chosen to keep close to that line, then the next part must turn farther back toward a time when winter had no electric light, and darkness was not only scenery, but a force testing whether people could still hold on to themselves. There are afternoons when the light leaves too early, as if it doesn't want to stay and witness what remains of the day. The sky turns the color of lead. Snow begins to fall heavier. The forest stands still, dark, unhurried. In the northern winters, before electricity, before paved roads and thick window glass, night was not only long, night had weight. It pressed down on rooftops, it tightened around the chest, and it made the distance between inside and outside a matter of survival. The wooden house at the edge of the forest keeps its fire low, just as it did at the beginning, not for atmosphere, for existence. Fire is the only thing that can persuade the cold to stop at a certain line. But fire also consumes. It consumes wood. It consumes time. It demands that someone inside go out, step into the snow, cut more, drag it back. Each trip is a small negotiation with the dark season, and every time the door opens, wind rushes in like a reminder. The outside does not belong to people. People only borrow a corner of warmth for a brief time. In the coldest months, what is frightening is not only the freeze, it is lack. Lack of food, lack of light, lack of certainty that tomorrow will resemble today. A grain store can thin faster than expected. Livestock can fall sick, can collapse in the night. A blizzard can block the road to market, block the path to a neighbor's home, block even the chance to ask for help. When the world is sealed under snow, people begin living inside a small circle. Fire, food, sleep, and the stories told to keep the mind from drifting. It is inside that circle that ritual appears as a form of order, not ritual as decoration, ritual as survival. Straightening the house when the wind is about to shift, locking the door at the right moment, placing things where they belong, repeating small actions as if telling the long night. The rhythm is still here, the rules are still here, and the straw goat near the window belongs to that rhythm too, like a sign set in the right place to complete an invisible ring of protection. Later, some people would call all of this superstition, but in old winters, belief was not meant to color life. Belief was a way to keep the spirit from panic. When the wind could not be controlled, people controlled what they could, the order inside the home. When the snow could not be commanded to stop, people commanded themselves. Follow the old rhythm, repeat, hold steady, and in that steadiness, fear becomes less endless. It gains a boundary. It stands on the far side of the door, instead of sitting in the center of the room. Winter, in that sense, is not only the backdrop of this story, it is the great darkness that reveals a small truth. People need something to hold on to when the world becomes too wide and too cold. A sign at the door, a low circle of fire, a dry straw figure from the last harvest. Simple things, but enough to say, an order is still at work here. And when order becomes a need, certain nights begin to carry a different meaning. There are stretches of time when a community feels the boundary grow thinner than usual, as if the dark season has stepped close to the threshold. It is there that the story stops asking only, "Why is there a straw goat?" and begins to ask something deeper. On those nights, what did people do to keep the boundary from being pushed back? Some winter nights are not like the others, not because the snow falls heavier or the wind screams louder, but because time itself feels altered. Day and night no longer separate cleanly. Light passes through the window like a thin layer of dust, then vanishes before it can truly brighten the room. In the wooden house at the edge of the forest, the fire still burns low, like a small heartbeat, keeping everything from slipping into meaninglessness. And in that kind of stretched darkness, people begin to believe there are moments when the border between inside and outside grows thinner than usual. Folklore in cold regions once spoke of seasonal turning nights, stretches of time between the old year and the new, when the world seems to pause and breathe. Not everyone called them the same thing, but the feeling is nearly the same. Dreams grow heavier. Small sounds make a person turn their head. The silence of snow feels like it is covering something. When winter becomes a presence, people do not face the cold only with coats and firewood. They face it with order, with signs, with small acts done at the right time, as if one wrong step would let the darkness move deeper. On nights when the border thins, the threshold receives more attention than any other place. The latch is checked, the windcloth is pulled straight, firewood is stacked close to the hearth, and the small objects placed near the door, sometimes a branch, sometimes a braided ring, sometimes a straw figure, are regarded with a quiet kind of respect. Not worship, acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that there are things that cannot be commanded, but can be set in the right place to keep a distance. The straw goat on the windowsill, then, is no longer a meaningless ornament. It becomes part of keeping the rhythm, like the final period in an ancient sentence the house still remembers. What is striking is this: those nights were not always told as fear, they were also told as hope. Because when the border is thin, it is not only the cold that can come close, the warm can be called back too. The thought that the sun will return, the thought that the harvest will return, the thought that the animals will live through the dark season. In a world where the future is often hidden by snow, hope needs a schedule. It needs a moment that can be named, even if only through a small act. And ritual, in its deepest sense, is that schedule. So when the fire burns low and the snow lies still beyond the porch, what happens inside the house is not a strange story for entertainment. It is a way of living, a way of wrapping worry in order, so worry does not spill across the room. And if every boundary needs a sign, then the question begins to shift, naturally. Of all the shapes that could have been chosen, why the shape of a goat? After nights when the border thins, the question is no longer whether the straw goat is beautiful. The question is why it was chosen. In a world full of shapes that straw can become, why did human hands choose the shape of a goat? Not a bird, not a deer, not a wolf, but an animal that is close, small, and familiar enough to live beside people through the long year. In cold regions, a goat is not only an animal, it is part of the household, even if it sleeps in the shed. Its milk enters the meals when the grain bin runs thin. Its meat becomes a promise of stored time when winter lasts longer than expected. Its hide becomes a layer of protection when wind cuts through cloth. And in many communities, a herd of goats is a measure of being enough, a breathing kind of wealth, a piece of the future that can be seen, touched, counted. The goat also carries a quality other animals don't have in quite the same way. It is stubborn. It is tough. It climbs broken rock where a person's foot would slip. It finds food where it seems nothing remains. In a harsh land, those traits are survival itself. The goat is like a piece of wild life, brought close to people, yet never fully softened. It reminds that life is not only gentle, life is also hard, also durable, also able to endure what seems impossible. And so when winter becomes a great force, the goat holds a special place in the mind. It is both hope and risk. A healthy herd is a sign the next season still holds a chance. A weak herd is a sign the dark season is winning. In lean years, every decision around livestock carries a quiet tension. Keep them, or use them. Feed them longer, or reduce the herd. Share, or hold back. Those choices are not told aloud in holiday songs, but they sit underneath every winter story. When straw is braided into the shape of a goat, a sealed meaning begins to show. Straw is what remains of the harvest. The goat is what remains of living wealth. To place the two together near the door, near the threshold, is like placing a reminder where the wind can reach it first. This house remembers the warm season that has passed. This house knows the dark season is out there, and what is most precious is not always bright or shining. It is often the thing that keeps tomorrow possible. In some older northern memories, the image of the goat appears as pulling strength, as hooves on frozen ground, as a sign woven into stories of winter and power. There is no need to speak the long names yet. It is enough to know that the goat was once seen as a life force, an engine, something that helped the wheel of time turn through the dark stretch. And when old stories were softened to live beside newer lives, the names could change, but the shape remained. So the answer to why a goat is not only aesthetic, it is that a goat is what people did not want to lose. And if a symbol chooses the most unlosable thing to stand at the door, then it is speaking of something deeper than luck. It is touching the price of continuing. And the next part will bring the story closer to the hearth, to see why fire was once the center of an entire world. Night falls early, as it always does. The snow beyond the porch makes every sound smaller except the wind. In the wooden house at the edge of the forest, light does not come from the ceiling. It comes from the hearth. The fire burns low and steady, without showing off. It doesn't try to make winter gentle. It does only one thing. It keeps the house a place that is still inside. Before electric light, the hearth was not only for cooking, it was the center of time. Everything was measured by how many times wood was added, by when water boiled, by when ash settled. People sat close to the fire, not because they liked to, but because they needed to. Knees turned toward the warmth, backs turned toward the dark, as if the body itself understood that the safest place was wherever firelight could reach. And when the fire became the center, the room arranged itself into a circle. Inside that circle were whispers, the scent of wood, steady breathing. Outside that circle was the long night, pressed against the walls like something that did not need to be invited in. This is where order begins. Not the order of written law, but the order of small things repeated correctly. Wood is stacked so it won't take on damp. Pots are set in the right place to save fuel. The door is closed at a certain hour, not by schedule, but by instinct. And the threshold is treated like a weakness that must be tended. The things placed near the door, a braided ring, a dry branch, or the straw goat, become part of the same act, completing the boundary. The straw goat still rests near the window, like a silent period. It doesn't make warmth, it doesn't block wind, but it does something else, more delicate. It says this house has prepared, that an older rhythm is being kept. In communities that lived a long time with snow, preparation was not only storing supplies, preparation was also arranging the mind. When the outside could not be controlled, people controlled what was within reach: the hearth, the circle, and the boundary. Fire also carries something strange. It comforts and it warns. Fire eats wood, and wood is not endless. Each time another log is added is a quiet admission that winter is still taking. But at the same time, each small flare is a sign that people still have the power to do something, however small. In the dark season, the greatest power can be as simple as keeping a flame from going out. And when the fire holds its rhythm, it pulls other rhythms with it. A meal becomes a ritual. Silence becomes shelter. An old story is told again, not to entertain, but to give the night structure. Inside that structure, fear does not disappear, but it is given a place. It stands outside the door, instead of sitting in the middle of the room. But there are years when that small order is not enough. There are winters when the grain store thins faster than expected, and the herd weakens like a fire starved of wood. Then the circle around the hearth begins to feel heavier. And in that heaviness, people arrive at an ancient thought. To keep the dark season from swallowing everything, sometimes something precious must be given up, like a way of telling the darkness that the boundary is still being respected. There are nights when the fire still burns, but the room no longer feels light. No one says it out loud, but everyone feels it. The grain store has dropped. The stacked dry wood against the wall looks like a thin promise. Outside, snow rises high, turning every road into a luxury of thought. Inside the wooden house at the edge of the forest, order is still kept. The door is still locked at the right time. The stove still receives its steady feed of wood. The straw goat still rests near the threshold. But the more everything is done correctly, the clearer one question becomes. If everything is done right and the dark season still presses down, what else can be done? In the memory of many old communities, winter was not only a time of waiting, it was a time when something had to be exchanged in order to continue. Not in the simple sense of buying and selling. In a deeper sense, when nature became unpredictable, people looked for a way to place a price in the right place, almost as if saying they understood the rules of the dark season, and they respected the boundary. That price was sometimes food shared evenly, so no one would be left behind. Sometimes it was a longer night keeping the fire. Sometimes it was cleaning the house, gathering old ash, laying fresh straw, as if making the space clean enough to pass through the dark stretch. And sometimes, in the harshest years, that price touched the herd. There is no need to describe it with heavy images. The cold fact is enough. Livestock is survival. To give up a piece of survival is a decision no one wants. But when winter stretches on, when stores are thin, when sickness moves through the shed like wind through a crack, people understand that keeping everything can also become the way to lose everything. The price of continuing, then, is not only an act, it is a collective choice. It says, a community is placing the future on a scale, and in that moment, what matters is not fear, but order. Fear tends to break people apart. Order makes people hold still together, in the circle of the hearth. It gives despair a shape. It turns chaos into something that can be carried as ritual. And ritual, even when simple, helps the mind believe there is a path through the night. The straw goat near the door begins to carry a deeper meaning. It is no longer only a memory of a real goat, or of an old harvest. It becomes the shape of a debt people once felt had to be placed in the right position. A debt not always owed to a specific god. Sometimes it was only a debt owed to winter itself, to the law of the land, to the truth that life must be paid for with life. And then, over time, as life changed, that direct price slowly disappeared from the telling. People stopped speaking of it the way they stopped touching a scar that has healed. But a scar does not vanish. It sinks beneath new skin. The straw goat remained, as a quiet way for memory to say that something heavy once sat here. And from that heaviness, culture begins the work it always does. It softens. For a tradition to live through many generations, it must change its shape, its voice, its intensity. And that is where the story begins to shift, in a quiet motion, away from the real price, and toward the form, away from a hard-to-speak decision, and toward a small object braided from straw. In later winters, not every year was equally harsh. Some years the snow came late. Some years the wind cut less. Some years the grain stores were thicker, and the herd made it through the dark season without leaving an emptiness in the shed. As life slowly became steadier, people still kept the old rhythm, but that rhythm began to breathe differently. Heavy things were no longer spoken aloud. Heavy things were set down deep, like ash gathered beneath a new layer of coals. In the wooden house at the edge of the forest, the hearth was still the center, but around the fire, another act began to appear more often. Braiding straw. Dry straw was pulled from its bundle, smoothed straight, folded, twisted into cord. Hands moved slowly, without hurry. Each stalk was light, but stacked together it carried a strange strength. It held shape. It held fingerprints. It held the scent of harvest, like a memory that had not yet dissolved. Straw is what remains after the grain has been stored away. It is the leftover of life less noticed, but always useful in the cold season. Straw lines, stalls, blocks wind, holds warmth. It sits in every corner of winter, living like a cushion, so the cold does not touch skin directly. And because it is so familiar, straw becomes the right material to carry memory, without making that memory too sharp. A quiet shift happens here. When stories of the price become hard to speak, shape begins to replace body. Not because people forget, because people need to continue without being crushed by what they once had to do. A tradition that wants to live a long time must learn how to change its clothes. It keeps the structure, but changes the weight. It keeps the sign, but makes the sign able to enter the house as something gentle. The straw goat is born inside that movement. It does not arrive suddenly. It rises like a thought from what is already there. Straw from the harvest, and the form of the animal tied to survival. Hands braid a body, braid legs, braid small horns, then bind it with a thin string. No elaborate decoration is required, only enough to recognize the shape. Because what matters is not beauty. What matters is recognition. When that shape is placed near the door, an older layer of memory is set back into its proper place, but with a new voice. It no longer speaks through a heavy decision. It speaks through repetition, through being there every year, through the house remembering that the dark season has a boundary, that some nights are not like other nights, that to make it through, the rhythm must be kept. And so the straw goat becomes a kind of substitute sign. It stands at the threshold like a period, so the sentence is not left unfinished. It holds the idea of a debt, but does not name the debt. It holds the idea of a price, but does not force anyone to stare directly at the price. It softens something that was once very hard, so later generations can hold it without shivering. But that softness creates a new secret. When everything becomes lighter, the old question does not disappear. It only becomes a whisper, and that whisper begins living inside the symbol, inside the placement, inside the habit no one explains. Because when a memory is too heavy to speak aloud, culture chooses another way to speak. It speaks softly. Inside the wooden house at the edge of the forest, everything looks simple. The fire burns low. Snow lies still beyond the porch. The straw goat sits near the window, like a small object that hardly matters. But some small things are placed in the right spot, not because they are extra, but because they are doing a job people no longer name. That is often how symbols begin. They do not arrive with trumpets. They do not arrive as a new rule. They arrive as a repeated act long enough that it starts to feel natural. Year after year, hands braid the straw, hands tie the string, hands place the goat near the threshold, and then, at some point, the question of why is no longer asked. Not because it is unimportant, but because the answer has left language and moved into the body. In communities that live a long time with the dark season, the most precious thing is not only food, it is the stability of the mind. When night stretches on, people need the feeling that the world has structure, that there are things done at the right time, that there are boundaries being held. Ritual, in its deepest sense, is a frame to hang worry on, instead of letting it fall into every corner of the room. And a symbol is how that frame keeps living when the spoken story grows thin. The straw goat can do this without explanation. Children see an animal shape and think of the holiday season, of warmth. Adults see the same shape and feel another layer deeper, quieter, not exactly clear knowledge, more like a sense that something once very serious was set down here, something once tied to continuing, something that once stood close to the threshold as a sign that this house had entered the dark season the right way. And that is the power of speaking softly. A loud statement can be argued with, forgotten, forbidden, but a straw figure placed at the door cannot. It challenges no one. It does not demand belief. It simply exists. And because it exists, it carries memory, the way straw carries the scent of old fields unseen, but still there. There is something else worth noticing. A symbol does not only preserve memory, it also teaches a way of feeling. When the straw goat is placed near the door, the house learns a habit, to look toward the threshold as an important place. A door is not only where people go in and out. A door is something to close at the right moment, open at the right moment, hold at the right degree. That attention, repeated long enough, becomes part of the feeling of safety. And when safety cannot be guaranteed, the feeling of safety becomes something that must be fed through small order. But small order always hides something larger. As time passes, the straw goat grows lighter in the telling. It becomes good luck, something pretty, a tradition. And right then, the central question returns not as a challenge, but as a soft knock from the other side of the door. If this is only a shape, what once lay in its place? Because a symbol does not appear to fill an empty space. It appears to cover an emptiness that was already there. And when it stands at the threshold, it is not only speaking about a goat, it is speaking about the boundary between what can be told and what must be kept quiet. Night falls again. Wood is added to the fire again. The straw goat remains still, as if it carries nothing at all. But that stillness is exactly what shows it is working. And the next part will move closer to the threshold, where the sign is not only to remember, but to guard. Night arrives like a heavy cloth. The snow beyond the porch quiets the whole world, until even the sound of wood tightening in the cold can be heard. Inside the wooden house at the edge of the forest, the fire burns low, casting a small circle of light that doesn't reach beyond a few steps. Everything else rests in a gentle darkness, as if the room knows its own limits. And at the edge of that limit stands the door. A door is not a minor detail in winter. It decides the difference between inside and outside. It is a thin plank of wood responsible for stopping wind, stopping snow, stopping cold from finding its way into the body. But it is also where the mind most easily places its worry, because anything that belongs to the world out there, storm, wild animals, sickness, bad news, must pass through the door if it wants to enter. So the threshold becomes the one point people can control, and yet never fully trust. In long snow regions, the threshold was often treated as a place that had to be kept, not with weapons, with rhythm. Sliding the latch at the right time, hanging something in the right place, clearing the entry so snow won't pack in, stacking wood near the hearth so the door won't need to open too many times. These are small actions, but together they form a system that says the house has order, and that order is the only thing people can build in front of a winter that does not obey. The straw goat lies near the window, and in the night its shape looks more like a sign than a decoration. It does not watch, it does not move, but its placement gives the threshold another layer of meaning, as if an old sentence has been set back where it belongs. This is the boundary. This is where attention must gather. This is where a period is needed so the story does not leak open. There may have been a time when people believed a sign at the threshold could hold distance between the house and the night. But even when that belief fades in the simple sense, the action survives. Because what people truly need is not a guarantee that nothing bad will happen. What they need is the feeling that they have done their part, that they have prepared, that they have not abandoned the boundary. And that feeling, in the dark season, can be as essential as food. So the straw goat becomes a kind of invisible guard. Not a guard meant to fight, a guard meant to remind. It reminds that a threshold is not only a place to pass through, it is a place that must be respected. It reminds that there are thin border nights, when everything feels closer, and it reminds that small things, if placed correctly, can keep the mind from slipping out of rhythm. But because it stands at the threshold, this symbol is also the first thing to be touched when a new world arrives, when belief changes, when laws change, when the story changes its voice. The things at the door are often renamed first, not because they are weak, but because they are the most visible. The place everyone crosses each day. The night is still long, the fire is still low, the straw goat is still. Yet outside, through snow and time, a larger motion is approaching, not a storm, but the shift of an entire order. And when the order shifts, the goat on guard will learn a new way to survive, no longer as a sign of fear, but as an object that can endure by becoming harmless. Some changes do not arrive with thunder. They come slowly, like falling snow, layer upon layer, until the next morning. Looking out the window, it becomes clear the landscape has shifted. In the north, across many generations, the old rhythms still clung to the wooden house at the edge of the forest. The hearth was the center, the door was the boundary, straw was the memory of harvest, and the straw goat was the sign placed in the right spot. But then, along with new roads, along with distant bells, along with different prayers, a new world began to step in. That change did not necessarily erase everything. More often, it chose something softer. It placed a new layer of meaning over the old. What was too rough, too heavy, too tightly tied to fear was pushed back into shadow. What could keep living was kept, but with a different story, a different reason, a different voice. Culture rarely destroys completely. It reuses, it edits. It makes old shapes just safe enough not to provoke resistance, and just familiar enough that people do not lose their rhythm. In those years, the straw goat did not disappear. It simply began to be seen differently. Before, it rested near the door as a sign of a boundary that had to be guarded, of a dark season that had to be respected. Now it could be called by lighter words, a traditional object, a holiday symbol, a sign of good luck. Older people might still feel the deeper layer underneath, the way a person can sense the scent of old ash beneath new coals. But they did not always speak it, and younger people might see the goat only as something that belongs to winter, nothing more. This is how a symbol survives. It lowers its voice. It dulls its edge. It pulls the heavy weight off the surface, so it can pass through time without being cut away. Stories about the price, the debt, the collective decisions, in lean years, those slowly leave the telling. Not because they are wrong, because they are too hard to carry into a newer life, where people want the season to be light and clear hope. When a new world arrives, it does not only bring new belief, it brings a new need, the need to make winter less frightening in memory. But softening is not the same as erasing. It is like laying cloth over something hard. The shape is still there underneath. And sometimes, the clearest trace of the older meaning is the simple fact that the straw goat is still placed near the door. Because if it were only decoration, it could sit anywhere. But if it still prefers the threshold, that suggests its ancient function guarding the boundary has not fully died. It has only changed the way it works. Inside the wooden house, the fire still burns low. People still check the latch when the wind shifts. And the straw goat, even when spoken of in a gentler voice, still rests where the wind touches first. Like a sentence no longer said aloud, but still performed. Like a ritual that has lost its explanation, but not its rhythm. A new world rarely kills a symbol. It only asks the symbol to learn how to smile. And when the goat begins to smile in the eyes of the world, that is when the next part will show how lamplight makes everything softer and how darkness remains. In small sensations, no one names. Once a new world had taken root, winter began to change in the way it was told. Not because snow fell less, or the wind grew warmer, but because people learned how to lay light over it. Light no longer came only from the hearth in the wooden house at the edge of the forest. It began to come from candles set on windowsills, from lanterns hung in the market, from rows of windows glowing at the same time like an entire village agreeing that darkness would not be allowed to take everything. Lamplight does what it always does. It softens sharp edges. It makes the long night look like scenery. It turns cold into a backdrop for warmth. And as the holiday season slowly became a time of gifts, of blessings, of meals fuller than usual, the older stories were adjusted to fit a newer need. What was once too heavy was pushed away from the center. What once carried a price was replaced with good luck, not because people wanted to deceive, because people wanted to breathe. In that process, the straw goat stepped into a different role. It no longer had to stand at the door as a stern reminder. It could stand at the door as a blessing. It could be hung up as something charming. It could be given as a sign of abundance. And so the same shape began to carry a different story. A story about tradition, about family, about a winter warmed by lamplight, and the repetition of familiar things. This is the bleaching that culture often performs on symbols that endure. It does not erase the shape. It simply changes the paint. It changes the gaze. It changes the language. It pushes fear down deep and pulls joy up to the surface. The straw goat is still straw, still braided strands, still a simple knot, but the meaning offered to everyday life becomes lighter, like first snow replacing hard ice. In a winter market, straw goats can be sold in bundles. In a home, one can stand beside other decorations. In memory, it can be tied to the smell of baking and the sound of laughter. Those scenes are real. They are not fake. But sometimes the reality of joy is exactly what makes people forget that this symbol once had another job: to hold a boundary, to carry memory, to soften something difficult to say. And even with the new layer laid on top, one thread still shows. The goat still prefers to be near the threshold, near the door, near the place the wind touches first. As if, in the collective memory, that position still matters more than any other. As if this small object is still doing its work, only more discreetly. It no longer says, "Be afraid." It says, "Keep the rhythm." It no longer speaks of the price. It speaks of abundance. But within that abundance, a thin shadow of the old meaning remains. Because bleaching does not make darkness disappear. It only makes darkness retreat to a place that is harder to name. It lives in the tiredness after the holiday season, in the silence when the long night returns, in the moment of standing near the door and suddenly wanting to check the latch without knowing why. And when lamplight has softened winter on the surface, the next part will look at something strange. Tradition sometimes lives strongest when it becomes habit, when the body acts before the mind has time to ask. After enough years of repetition, there comes a familiar moment when the hands move without thinking. The string is cut to the right length, the straw is braided neat, the small goat is set on the windowsill or hung near the window frame, as if it were simply part of preparing the house for the cold season. In the wooden home at the edge of the forest, the action happens quietly, without ceremony. No one stands to announce it. No one offers a long explanation. It is simply something that should be done, like adding wood before the wind changes. Habit has a strange power. It does not need a clear reason, yet it endures. It passes through generations like a heartbeat present, without needing to prove itself. And when a festival becomes habit, the symbols that travel with the festival change the way they exist. The straw goat is no longer viewed as a stern sign of a boundary, and it is no longer told as a grand story about the dark season. It becomes part of the scene, something that belongs to winter, like snow and lamplight. But that ordinary feeling is exactly what is worth noticing, because if the straw goat were just another decoration, it would have drifted away with taste, with fashion, with things that change quickly, and yet it remains, still straw, still a simple shape, still a small knot, and often still near the door. It seems this symbol does not survive by being new. It survives by doing a quiet job that habit helps conceal. In modern life, people may call it tradition, smile, and move on. But the body often remembers more than words. When an action is repeated at the right time, it creates a feeling of stability. It tells the mind that winter has arrived, and that everything is being placed where it belongs. As if doing enough of these small tasks can make the long night feel less uncertain, that is when ritual becomes mechanism. There is no need to believe in a religious sense. It is enough to notice that certain actions make the world feel more ordered inside the head. The straw goat, in its newer role, becomes part of that mechanism. It is the starting signal of the season. It is punctuation in the house. Once it has been placed, winter has been named in a way that feels safe. And when a symbol becomes mechanism, it begins working in the smallest moments. Stepping through the door, the eyes pass over the goat's shape. When the wind rises, a hand tightens the latch without thinking. When night stretches long, someone feels the urge to add wood a little earlier. Not because of fear of something specific, because the body wants to keep the rhythm. Those small things link together into a single feeling. The dark season is still out there, but in here, there is structure. And yet every mechanism hides a history. If habit makes things easier, it also makes the deeper question harder to hear. And that question still waits, like a soft knock from beyond the boundary. Why has a simple straw object been kept for so long? Why does it still choose to stand near the door? And in the end, what did it replace something people no longer want to speak aloud? When the question returns, it does not break the festival. It only gives the lamplight a thin shadow. And that thin shadow will lead into the next part, where small details, the way it is hung, the way it is placed, the time it appears begin to show themselves as traces of an older structure still lying beneath the surface. When a tradition becomes habit, it is easy to assume it has turned into mere form. But form is rarely meaningless, especially in places where winter lasts. In the wooden house at the edge of the northern forest, the straw goat still appears at the right time, like a small signal that the year has reached its dark stretch. What matters is not that the goat is there. What matters is the details. Almost no one explains, yet almost everyone repeats in nearly the same way. It is often placed near a window or close to the front door, not in the center of the room, where it would be easiest to display, but at the threshold where wind can reach, where the eye passes over it while stepping in. Some homes hang it with a thin string, as if they do not want it touching the ground. Some set it on the sill like a light watch. The methods differ, but the shared point remains. The goat stays close to the boundary, as if a collective memory still knows this was once the most important place in the dark season. Even the act of braiding straw is not always done at random. In some places it happens in the first days of cold. In others it waits until the season nears the festival, not because of an exact calendar, but because of a sense of right timing. People who live with winter often carry a different kind of clock in the body. When the wind shifts, when the nights grow longer, when the fire must be fed earlier, and when the body says the dark season has arrived, the small actions begin. Cleaning, stacking, locking, placing the sign. The straw goat enters that sequence like the last step, like a period that closes a sentence of preparation. Some customs still hold a quiet trace of giving. A straw goat can be offered as a wish for abundance, for luck, for a year that makes it through the cold. It sounds light, but looked at closely, it is not only a gift, it is a transfer of spiritual responsibility. Keep the rhythm, keep the home, keep the boundary. The receiver may only smile, but the act of taking it and placing it near the door often happens with no hesitation, as if the object knows where it belongs. Small details like these resemble stitches on a coat that has been repaired many times. The tear might be forgotten, but the thread remains, proof that there was once a place that needed reinforcement. Tradition works the same way. When the larger story thins with time, the small action becomes the archive. It keeps the old structure without needing words. It keeps the function without needing a reason. This is what makes the straw goat different from many holiday decorations. It is not only a shape, it comes with a placement, a timing, a way of setting it down, as if the symbol refuses to leave its first task, to stand where the boundary is, and to remind that the boundary exists. Whether it is called luck or tradition, the behavior still says something deeper. The dark season is crossed through order, and when these traces are seen clearly, the central question returns quiet and durable. If only small habits remain, what once made them so important? To answer that without turning the story into a lecture, the next part will move more slowly into the deeper layer. Why the threshold, the darkness, and the price return again and again inside the same symbol, as if the straw goat is guarding not only the door of a house, but the door of the mind. In the wooden house at the edge of the forest, the straw goat still rests near the window as something small, but when it is watched for longer, the shape begins to look like a map. Not a map of geography, but a map of the mind. Some symbols are not made to tell a clear story. They are made to keep something invisible standing still in the right place. And the straw goat, set at the threshold, always returns to an old idea. Boundary. Winter is the dark part of the year, not only because light is scarce, but because winter cuts away what is extra. Life narrows. It forces attention onto what is truly needed: warmth, food, community, and order. In the language of symbols, winter often becomes the image of darkness, the part of life that cannot be negotiated, the part that cannot be solved by desire alone. It is the stretch where life must prove it is durable enough to pass through. When darkness grows that large, a clear boundary becomes necessary. Not a boundary to fight over, a boundary to know where one stands. A threshold does that work in ordinary life. It divides inside and outside, but it also does that work in inner life. It divides what can be carried from what is too wide to hold. That is why signs are placed at doors, and the straw goat, surviving in that exact position for so long, becomes a reminder that a boundary is not only wood and a latch. A boundary is an idea that keeps the mind from dissolving in the dark season. Then comes the next layer. The price. In harsh years, people once felt that surviving winter was not only waiting, it was a kind of exchange, a kind of acceptance that continuing has a cost, even when that cost is not spoken aloud. Later, as life softened this layer, the price stopped being described directly, but its trace remained in the symbol, like an older rhythm that does not vanish. The straw goat became the shape of something both precious and fragile, survival, and what it costs to hold it. And finally, there is the layer of symbol itself. A symbol is how the mind stores heavy things without letting them crush ordinary life. It is like a box, not sealed shut, but closed enough that what is inside does not spill everywhere. The straw goat is that kind of box. It allows the memory of winter, of boundaries, of price, to be carried across generations, without anyone needing to retell it in full. Children see only a straw figure. Adults may feel only a thin shadow of the older meaning. But that thin shadow is often what lasts the longest. So when the straw goat becomes cute in modern eyes, it does not become false. It only shows the symbol has learned to survive. It has changed its voice. It has learned to smile. Yet it still stands at the threshold, a sign that the dark season has a boundary, and that boundary must be held through small order. And seen this way, another truth begins to surface. Winter's darkness does not vanish just because life changes. It only changes its address. It moves from snow beyond the porch to empty spaces inside the chest, from wind at the door to sleepless nights. The next part will step into that inner winter, where the symbol still works, even when no one can name the work anymore. After the holiday lights dim, the house becomes quiet in a different way. No more hurried noise. No more feeling that joy has to happen on schedule. Only the long evenings returning to their familiar place. In the wooden house at the edge of the forest, the fire still burns low, like an old habit that needs no reminder. The straw goat is still near the window. Snow still lies beyond the porch. And in that repetition, something becomes clearer. Winter is not only outside. Today, many things can make the cold season less dangerous. Doors are stronger, clothes are warmer. Food no longer depends entirely on one year's grain store. But even when life changes, winter still carries a feeling that is hard to avoid. A narrowing. Days shorten. The body goes outside less. Gatherings become fewer. And in the empty space that narrowing creates, the mind tends to turn inward, not always gently, often heavily. Some people feel the end of the holiday season leaves behind a quiet they did not ask for. A room can still smell like baked bread, but the laughter has moved far away. A calendar has flipped to a new page, but energy does not keep pace. The long night returns, and with it come the old questions. Is there enough? Will it be in time? Is anyone close? Those questions are not snow, but they share the same nature, cold, silent, and able to cover everything if there is no small point to hold on to. That is why winter symbols that endure are rarely only decorative. Even when the straw goat has been softened until it becomes cute, it still keeps a deeper function. It gives the mind a shape to hold. It stands near the threshold as a sign that the dark season has been named, that the long night has been given a frame, that there is a boundary between out there and in here, even if out there is no longer a snowy forest, but an invisible anxiety. In the inner winter, the hearth changes meaning too. It is no longer only defense against cold. It becomes a point for attention to gather, a place the eyes can rest, so the mind does not drift, a small rhythm that can be repeated so the day does not break apart. Add wood, heat water, straighten the corner by the door, set the straw goat neatly back in place. These acts do not solve everything, but they create the feeling that the world still has structure, and when structure remains, a person is less easily pulled away by darkness. Maybe this is why signs at thresholds live so long. They are a simple way to say that boundaries exist, that not everything is allowed to spill into the mind, that there is an inside the house within the human being, one that needs warmth the way a real room does. The straw goat, in its silence, reminds that safety sometimes begins with knowing where one stands in the dark season. And seen this way, one detail becomes even more striking. The straw goat does not appear only to decorate the holidays. It appears when the mind most needs a sign to cross a turning point. When nights grow longer, the sign is set down. When the holiday lights fade, the sign remains, as if it does not belong to noise, but to the hush after noise. And there, in that hush, the central question touches the surface again. If the straw goat is doing this work for the mind today, what work did it do for the mind long ago? The next part will step directly into that mechanism when fear needs a shape, so it can be set down, instead of spreading through the whole room. Some fears do not arrive as a loud sound. They arrive like fog, thin, clinging, changing the look of everything. In the wooden house at the edge of the forest, fear in the past might have been a blizzard, a weakening herd, a thinning grain store. Today, fear might be loneliness, exhaustion, the feeling of falling behind life. But even when the names change, the mind often reacts the same way. It wants fear to have a shape, because the invisible is always harder to endure. Wind can be heard, snow can be seen, but anxiety has no edges. It has no door that can be closed. It can spill in at any moment, like darkness filling a room when the fire grows weak. So across many cultures, people learned a quiet skill, placing fear into an object, an action, or a sign, not to make fear vanish, to give fear an address. That is why small rituals around the hearth exist. That is why the threshold is cared for. And that is why the straw goat is placed near the window, like something small but properly set. It is like a simple straw box, not locked, not sealed, but enough for the mind to say to itself, the dark season has been acknowledged. Darkness has its place, and that place is not the center of the room. When people set a sign at the threshold, they are doing two things at once. One faces outward, confirming the boundary between the house and the night. The other faces inward, confirming that order still holds inside. Order is what makes fear less endless. When fear has a shape, it slips into fewer corners. It becomes like a cloud that can be seen, instead of a bottomless sky. The straw goat does that work in a gentle way. It is not a charm in the simple sense. It is a carrier. It carries the feeling that the house has prepared, that winter has been named, that an older rhythm is still running. And that rhythm, even if it is only placing a straw figure in the right spot, can help the mind breathe more evenly. This also explains why the symbol survives, even when the original story has faded. A story can be forgotten, but a useful inner mechanism rarely disappears. It only changes how it appears to fit the time. The straw goat may once have been tied to heavy decisions in lean years. Later, it became a blessing, then a decoration. But beneath the surface, the function stays similar: to give fear a small shape, so it can be set down at the threshold instead of carried in the chest all night. In the wooden house, people may no longer speak of thin borders or the price of continuing, but the hand still places the straw goat near the door, and that act alone is enough to reveal something. Some part of the human being still believes the dark season should be crossed through order, not through panic. Seen this way, the central question is no longer simple curiosity. It becomes a key. If the straw goat is a box for fear today, what did that box hold long ago? And to avoid getting lost in endless arguments, the next part will ask the question in the most practical way. Does the truth lie in a single origin story, or in the function the symbol still performs, even when no one can name it anymore? There is a point every search for origins eventually reaches, and then falls quiet. It is the moment of realizing that the past is rarely a single straight line. Tradition does not grow like a lone tree. It grows like a forest. Many branches intertwine. Many layers settle over each other. Many stories pass through the same symbol, leaving traces the way snow falls on snow. So with the straw goat at the threshold, if the hunt is only for one final answer about where it began, the story will always open into more side paths. In one place, it is called good luck. In another, it is treated as a holiday sign. In another, someone remembers it, once carried a sterner weight. And between those tellings, there are blurred places that certainty cannot fill. But blur does not make the symbol less real. If anything, it proves the symbol has lived long enough to carry many lives. In the wooden house at the edge of the forest, the fire still burns low. Snow still lies beyond the porch. The straw goat still rests near the window. And that steady repetition suggests a different, more practical way to see it. The deepest truth of a symbol is not only where it started, it is what it does. What work does it perform for people in the dark season? Seen that way, the layers begin to settle into a clear structure. First, boundary. The straw goat near the threshold is not an accident. It makes the doorway a place that receives attention, care, and completion through a sign. It helps the house hold the feeling of inside when the world outside is cold and wide. Next, rhythm. The symbol arrives at the right time, returns each year, and creates an inner schedule. It says winter has come, and people are entering the dark stretch through order. Even when no one tells the old story anymore, the body still recognizes the rhythm, like it recognizes the crack of wood in the fire. Then, containment. Fear needs a shape so it can be set down. The straw goat becomes a simple winter box. It gives anxiety an address instead of letting it spill everywhere. It does not erase darkness, but it gives darkness an edge. And when darkness has an edge, it is less able to swallow a person whole. And finally, memory. Straw carries the scent of old fields. The goat carries the idea of survival. Together, they hold a trace of a time when people crossed the cold season through difficult choices. Even if that meaning has been softened, the fact that the symbol still exists shows the memory has not disappeared. It has simply learned how not to hurt. Seen this way, the straw goat does not need one perfectly correct origin story to matter. It matters because it functions. It holds the boundary. It holds the rhythm. It contains fear. It holds memory. And that is why it survives through different ages, even after becoming lighter, gentler, and wrapped in holiday lamplight. But there is one more thing that needs to be touched before the story closes. When the symbol is seen as function, when the layers have settled, what remains is not an explanation. It is a feeling. The moment of standing near the door, looking at the quiet straw shape, and suddenly realizing that some things smile, not because they are harmless, but because they have passed through a great deal of darkness and are still here. The wooden house at the edge of the forest returns to its familiar scene. Snow beyond the porch keeps falling without needing to be reminded. Night stays long without asking permission. The fire burns low, like a steady promise made to the room itself. And on the windowsill, the straw goat remains small, dry, light as if it carries nothing but the shape of a gentle animal. But after moving through all those layers of time, that shape is no longer just straw. It becomes a meeting point, where invisible threads come together. Straw is the memory of harvest. The goat is the memory of survival. The door is the memory of boundary. The fire is the memory of order. And the snow, with its thick silence, is the memory of darkness people once had to live with, not merely pass through. In the present, the straw goat might be bought at a market, hung up as decoration, given as a blessing. Those things are real. They do not make the symbol false. They are simply the new clothing the symbol needs in order to endure. Because a symbol that wants to live a long time cannot keep speaking in the same voice. It must learn to speak more softly. It must learn to become pleasant enough to be brought indoors, set on a windowsill, photographed beside warm lights. And that is the moment the symbol smiles. Not the smile of a joke, but the smile of something that has been softened, so it will not hurt the one who carries it. A smile like fresh snow laid over hard ground. The surface becomes gentle, but the ground is still there. So when the straw goat is seen in the firelight, what matters is not forcing it back into a heavy story. What matters is noticing that its quiet work is still happening. It still stays close to the threshold, as a sign that a boundary exists. It still appears in the rhythm of the season, reminding that time has a dark stretch and a bright stretch. It still gives the mind a shape to set down, instead of letting worry spread through the whole room. Maybe this is why so many old customs never disappear entirely. They transform, they change their voice, but they keep their function because the function is still needed. Even in homes sealed against wind, even with electric light, even with food no longer tied to a single harvest, people still face their own dark stretches. And in those stretches, a small sign at the door can be enough to say, the dark season has been seen, and an order is still standing guard. The straw goat does not explain itself. It does not ask anyone to believe. It only exists in the strongest way, quietly, and in the right place. And sometimes that very quietness lets something strange be felt. That this symbol is like a reminder, wrapped to be light. There was a time when continuing to live was an achievement, and people had to learn very small ways to keep themselves from coming apart. The night beyond the porch is still thick. The fire is still low. The straw goat is still. And when the holiday season passes, what remains is not a final answer. What remains is a feeling. The feeling that a small object can carry a vast history and still smile gently enough to be placed near the door. And from that feeling, the final part will not try to close the story with a conclusion. It will only open a hush, where what is most ancient is not in fear itself, but in how people learn to move through fear, with a low fire, with a boundary, and with a straw sign set in the right place. When the holiday season passes, the house returns to the true rhythm of winter. Some lights are put away. Voices grow fewer. The warmth of gatherings recedes like a tide, revealing the long silence beneath every moment of joy. Snow remains beyond the porch. The forest still darkens early, and in the wooden house at the edge of the forest, the fire still burns low, like a small promise that night will not devour everything. The straw goat is still near the window. It doesn't vanish when the music stops. It doesn't need to be mentioned to keep existing. It lies there, light and dry, like something unimportant. But some things remain not because they stand out. They remain because they do something necessary in the time people least want to speak about, the time after the lights go out. In older centuries, winter may have been a question of survival. In newer centuries, winter may be only a season, but inside the human being, winter can always return as a state. The feeling of not enough, the feeling of emptiness, the feeling of being narrowed, the feeling of not knowing what waits ahead. And that is why symbols like the straw goat still have a place. Not to retell the past in full, but to keep a simple inner mechanism alive. Set the boundary, hold the rhythm, and give darkness an edge. A low fire does not promise everything will be fine. It only keeps the room from becoming cold enough to lose meaning. The straw goat is the same. It does not promise winter will be kind. It only says by resting in the right place that the house has prepared, that the dark season has been seen, that some part of the human still knows how to cross the cold stretch without coming apart. Some older cultures did not see leaving a story open as failure. It was a choice, because certain things, if sealed shut with a final conclusion, lose their deepest function. That function is not to provide information. It is to keep the right distance between people and what is too large. Between ordinary life and the darkness, everyone must meet in their own way. So what remains after the holiday season is not a conclusion about origins, and not a judgment on the modern world. What remains is an image, a threshold in the night, a hearth in silence, and a straw goat as a small sign of memory. A memory that has been softened so it won't hurt, yet still real enough to touch something deep in the mind. Looking at that straw shape one last time before turning off the light, there may be no need to believe in anything at all, only to recognize something simple. People once lived through dark seasons, through small order, by placing one sign in the right spot, by keeping the fire from going out, by understanding that boundaries exist, and that boundaries must be cared for. Outside, snow still falls, as if it has been falling for a very long time. Inside, the fire still burns low, as if it has burned through countless nights. The straw goat remains still, as if it has stood there across many generations. And if something ancient still lives in all of this, it may not be fear. It may be the way people learn to move through fear, without speaking loudly, through silence, through rhythm, and through a small sign at the door.